Good morning and welcome to our Trinity Forum. We are so thrilled to welcome Samira Malone of the Center for Regenerative Solutions, recently from the Cleveland Tree Coalition. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with just a little bit of presentation as Samira shares her work, and then we'll lead into a conversation. So we will do a more thorough introduction and bio in just a moment so that we can have a more succinct podcast, right? It's all about the content that we produce. So, Samira, welcome to the Trinity Forum.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about all things trees, and especially with the backdrop of it being the celebration of Earth Day for this entire weekend, but today in particular. So really salient time to be talking about the environment.
So as your presentation is starting very much with the Tree Coalition itself.
Yes.
And say just a little bit, you have recently concluded your work there.
Yeah.
Have they identified a new executive director, or are they still working on that?
So they are in the process of identifying a new executive director. So fortunately enough, when I came onto the organization in 2022, actually, I had the opportunity to serve as their inaugural executive director, so their first ever. Really spent the last 2 years building out the framework of the organization, going through strategic planning and beginning to implement on some of the activities that we identified through the Cleveland Tree Plan. And so now they're looking for a new director. Really excited to see whoever steps into that new role, but I'm excited that I'm still able to support the work here in Cleveland through my new role. I currently am the Director of Urban Forestry Initiatives for the Center for Regenerative Solutions, which is an environmental and climate resiliency kind of focusing national nonprofit organization that works across the entire country with cities just like Cleveland. So very excited to still be able to work here in the city that I call home for my entire life. I'm very much so a Cleveland girl and excited to be able to still support.
And one of the remarkable things about trees and about tree canopy is how much they connect to issues of justice, of not only environmental justice, but also racial justice.
Yep.
How redlined neighborhoods, you can often tell which neighborhoods have been redlined by the extent to which they have a tree canopy, their tree canopy is complete. And one thing that really amazed me, and I first heard your work at a City Club forum, it was Cleveland, the Reforested City,
Yep.
where to learn that cities used to be green, lush paradises.
Yes.
And that so much has changed across the American urban landscape.
Absolutely.
To say nothing of Cleveland. So I wonder if you could, I'm going to tee up your
Yes.
your slide deck now. If you could share just a little bit of what happened from when we were the forest city 100 years ago to where we are today.
And we're going to talk much more about that in the presentation itself, but what's always been very interesting to me, especially looking at the change of Cleveland's natural assets landscape over time, is that some of the earliest documentations of Cleveland talk about how densely forested it was. Actually, I remember reading a journal entry from some French aristocrats who were here to visit for business, and they said that they arrived on the shores of Lake Erie and it looked like this very dense forest, and as they got closer and closer to the shoreline, it was almost like a city emerged out of the forest. They were amazed at how even post really the actualization of the Industrial Revolution and the density that we now see of the city of Cleveland, they were amazed that there was this thriving, bustling metropolitan that was really being carved into this forest, but it was still keeping its forested integrity. So that was something that was very interesting to me, especially even in looking at a historical context, that how can we be someplace 100 years ago, and then we find ourselves 100 years later, and we have almost, if even a quarter of that canopy that we formerly had. The city of Cleveland, before its full development, was about 94% forest. And so now we sit at about 18% forest coverage in the city of Cleveland proper. So it really calls out how it does not take that much, it doesn't take a significant amount of time for us to lose so much of our natural assets, which is why it's so important for the work of our organization, or my former organization, and many others across the city, which I'll talk about, to be invested in this work, because it's the work of tomorrow. If we don't do anything about it now, then that 18 is going to dwindle down to 14, then dwindle down to 10, and we don't want to see it, because again, the natural environment and the human experience are symbiotic. We need nature to be healthy. We need nature to thrive. And so when we're divorced from that, it has so many impacts on our quality of life, our social determinants of health. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in the presentation.
This is so good. I'm actually going to start and do the official introduction, because I don't want any of that to not be on the podcast. So Samira Malone is the National Urban Forest Portfolio Lead at the Center for Regenerative Solutions, a USDN-sponsored initiative at the forefront of urban forestry development. Samira's leadership will be pivotal in enhancing equitable access to urban tree canopy, fostering community engagement, and advancing climate resilience efforts, and supporting their ecosystem of implementation partners across the country. Previously, Samira served as the executive director of the Cleveland Tree Coalition, orchestrating collaborative efforts to grow a sustainable urban forest in Cleveland. Through her leadership, the coalition achieved milestones like strategic planning, grant programs, and successful advocacy and platform building, amassing over $1 million in support. As an urban planning practitioner, Samira holds a bachelor's in urban and regional planning, a master's in urban planning and development, a GIS certification. She, however, claims to be a professional tree hugger, which I think is beautiful. Her dedication extends beyond her professional roles as a proud Cleveland native and chair-elect for the Urban Forestry Commission. She champions community and environmental justice as her personal and professional praxis. And we welcome you to the Trinity Forum. For those of you following on the podcast, my name is BJ Owens. I'm the Dean of Trinity. And the introduction that Samira just gave us was profound. That to imagine French explorers arriving in Cleveland when we had a 94% tree canopy cover, now we have 18. But looking when it had that 94% cover and seeing nothing but forest, and then arriving and amidst this lush green canopy is a city that is thriving and beautiful. For us to have gone from there to 18%, how do we not go farther and turn it around? And then, Samira, will you say again that wonderful thing you just did about the symbiotic relationship?
Yes, so the symbiotic relationship between humans and the natural environment, and the fact that we should not be divorced from it, because being divorced from nature has so many adverse implications on our quality of life, our quality of health. I'll talk a little bit about even the economic vitality that urban forestry and just natural assets bring to a community in general. So it's really a part of a larger ecosystem. We're a part of a larger ecosystem. And although our trees exist within an urban context, which is a little bit unnatural, right? It's still an ecosystem nonetheless. So figuring out the perfect balance between having, of course, a dense, thriving city, but also having quality green infrastructure and natural assets to help support our quality of life.
What was that word you just said? Quality green infrastructure. What is that? Tell us about green infrastructure.
So green infrastructure is pretty much an umbrella statement of different assets. So you can think of green infrastructure as being natural assets like trees, parks, and green space. Green infrastructure can also be the types of concrete that we're using. So if we're looking at pervious pavement and how stormwater flows through that, that's also green infrastructure. So I kind of switch in between green infrastructure and natural assets. Natural assets is really speaking specifically about nature in the ecosystem that provides as a piece of infrastructure.
Excellent, thank you. And with that, we would love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, so we're gonna dive into the presentation. I introduced myself a little bit already, so I'm gonna bypass that slide. But fortunately enough, as I mentioned, I had the opportunity to serve as the inaugural executive director of the Cleveland Tree Coalition, which is a really wonderful organization comprised of 50+ members that all have the vested interest and commitment in increasing Cleveland's tree canopy from 18% to 30%. And so the coalition itself was established in 2015. Actually, a bunch of leaders in 2013 came together for Cleveland Sustainability Summit. Many of you may be familiar with that, where sustainability leaders from all over the region would come together and wrap their minds around really challenging environmental climate-related tasks. And what rose to the area of importance in that particular convening was the fact that we were losing a significant amount of canopy. The city of Cleveland is losing anywhere between 75 to 90 acres of canopy on an annual basis. Wow. So the leaders got together and were like, we need to do something about it. What really kind of was a call to action around it was that when you look at the municipal lines of Cleveland, you could see them starkly. Once upon a time, you couldn't see the municipal lines of Cleveland because you had trees, you had green space that kind of operated as a green buffer, but you could see these stark municipal lines now, and they were like, oh, we need to do something about that. And so that's how the Cleveland Tree Coalition was created, through the convening of those very critical partners. And so as I mentioned, the coalition serves in a really unique capacity because we have 50 plus member organizations. Let me not touch myself. I'm a person who likes to talk with their hands, so I need to be a little bit more dainty up here. So the coalition serves in this really interesting capacity because we have 50 plus member organizations, but we have the opportunity to play this liaison in the landscape where we can help bridge various resources needed to realistically reach that canopy goal that I'll talk about in a little bit. So one of our roles is to, of course, funding trees. Money does not go on trees prior to popular belief. We have a very robust goal of raising $100 million over the next 10 years. We serve as a gap filler, so we do have many organizations that are doing phenomenal work, but we're constantly taking a look at the landscape and seeing where areas of opportunity to bridge a need. We are the organizer and coordinator of all tree-related activities within the city of Cleveland, so we work very closely not only with our partner organizations, but we also do regional and statewide coordination. During my tenureship as executive director, I was constantly working with other similar models in other cities to see what are best practices, where are some lines of connectivity through the work, where are opportunities that we can jointly go after resources or just leverage an ecosystem of knowledge. And then lastly, but certainly not least, shifting the public sentiment about trees, which is why I love coming and having these conversations. I always say that I love to spread the gospel of trees and how beautiful they are and how much they have a phenomenal impact on our ecosystem and how we need to invest in them. So one of the roles of our organization was to definitely shift the public sentiment around the value and benefits of trees, not only just with residential stakeholders, but with policy and decision makers. And so to give us a little bit of geographical context as to what our canopy is in comparison to others, here in the city of Cleveland, as I mentioned, we have an 18% canopy. And that in comparison, especially to the rest of Cuyahoga County that has an aggregated 35% canopy, but each municipality varies. We are the light green blob that sticks out like a sore thumb in comparison to our municipal peers around Cuyahoga County. So there is a specific investment that has to be made in the city of Cleveland proper, which is why it takes so much effort for us to work alongside our county government as well as our state government to get the necessary resources that we need in order to catch Cleveland up even to our municipal peers.
And I would imagine, Samira, that every neighborhood is not the same. Even in Cleveland, that's
we'll talk about that.
Oh, okay.
We'll talk about that. You are queuing me up. Thank you. So this is diving even deeper into the neighborhood data. So the city of Cleveland is comprised of 33 unique neighborhoods. That's what I've always loved about Cleveland, is that it is just this modge podge of communities. But what it really calls out is that not only is there a need for us to increase canopy, but there has to be a framework of environmental justice and racial equity in that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in this next slide. But this map right here identifies all of the 33 neighborhoods that we have in our backyard. And it took a look at a few things. It took a look at population density. It took a look at population of communities of color, elderly population, and then it also weighted up against population of health metrics data. So taking a look at asthma rates and cardiovascular disease. And it took that and created a map where we could prioritize the neighborhoods that had the highest need and the highest opportunity for impact. And of course, lo and behold, the neighborhoods that had the highest need for canopy and the highest opportunity for impact because of all of those disproportionate factors like cardiovascular rate, high rates of cardiovascular disease and asthma were also Black and brown neighborhoods, which is why it's so critical not only for this work to be centered in environmental justice, but it has to be focused on racial restorative justice, because these are also the neighborhoods that are being the most disproportionately impacted by not having canopy coverage, by not having quality green infrastructure, parks, and green space. It doesn't just stop at trees, of course, as you know.
And I want to tee you up and say why is it, but I know you're going to get there.
We're going to get there. I love this.
I have a bad habit of reading ahead, and I'm very, very impatient. You're doing great.
I love it. I love it. So one of the things that I always like to talk about when we're having this conversation about how did we get here and why is our canopy the way that it is, of course, there's a multitude of reasons as to why our canopy is the way that it is. But when you layer in policy and legislation, you have a really critical understanding of how policy plays a significant role in resources and investment. It then it interwoves this story between natural environment and intentional disinvestment in communities of color. And so when you look at a redlining map and you look at a tree canopy map, if you look at many maps that quantify various benefits or disproportionate impacts, unfortunately, the redlining map and a tree canopy map look the exact same because the neighborhoods that fell within those red zones were the ones that were strategically disinvested in, therefore no longer having the same resources, maintenance, and care poured into maintaining things like trees, maintaining things like parks and green space. So again, just continuously reinforcing the importance of not only looking at this from an environmental scope, but we have to have a really holistic lens as to how we're going to realistically and sustainably increase our urban canopy, especially in our most vulnerable communities.
It's really remarkable, and we spent some time a number of years ago looking at redlining here at Trinity. It's remarkable how, especially when one starts with such a dramatic bias in the built environment, how that then creates the conditions for the kind of otherwise seemingly benign, incremental, it's just a platform for decline.
Yep.
That you can see every decision after that cascades and becomes a cumulative reinforcer of that kind of concentrated poverty.
Yes.
It's really devastating.
It's a buildup. I think that oftentimes, especially when you're just going through life and living life, that you look at things from an isolated perspective. Oh, this is happening here, but it may not have a connection here, but everything is holistically connected to one another. So that's one of the things that we really try to reinforce when we're talking about this work, is that it's part of a larger ecosystem of disinvestment and decline that we're trying to combat.
Yeah, and what's our time horizon? Because your typical political cycle is what can I get done in the next 2 or 4 years?
Yeah.
I like to think that as the church, we have the ability to see on a larger time horizon. An oak tree doesn't care what our time horizon is. It's going to grow slowly at its own rate.
Yeah.
But it has to be maintained and cared for.
Yes.
And we have to, as neighborhoods, as leaders, as a city, have both the courage and the foresight to say we're going to commit to something for the life of an oak.
Yep.
And that's a long time.
And that's also a challenge, right? So a significant challenge is the fact, what you mentioned, the political landscape is constantly changing. I didn't realize when I got into this work how political trees could be, right? Not from the place
I believe it.
Not from the place of like...
How do maples vote?
Exactly.
Right?
Like, you could almost be, you could build a political platform around environment. Our mayor ran on a political platform of the environment. And so one of the things that our organization is driving is figuring out what are sustainable funding mechanisms, because as you said, there is a timetable that politics and people are running on, but there's also a timetable that the environment is running on. Right. And we have to be a lot more realistic about investing in that timetable, which is why the education and shifting public sentiment and having what I call this work is having to build a collective consciousness about the value proposition of trees. And again, as somebody who sits here and who lives and breathes trees all day, I can sit on my soapbox and tell you all day how beautiful and wonderful they are. But also the reality of it is that there are many people who have a negative experience with trees, right? When I think about these redline communities, folks barely have the resources to take care of themselves and their families. So I can't have the same conversation about, oh, you should have an arborist come to your house. Well, if you don't have money to pay for your groceries, then what can you care about an arborist for? So we have to figure out unique ways to position this investment as a value proposition, but I am a firm believer that the investment first and foremost needs to come through our public sector, from our civic sector, and from our corporate sector to help offset the cost for everyday residents. Because people don't have the resources that they may once upon a time or even ever had to even take care of a tree. And that doesn't mean that they can't eventually, but the resources have to be made from these larger entities to really get things up to speed so that we can get to a more critical conversation about how people are stewarding their individual land. But I also find it very interesting, as we talked very early on, as we were talking about this discussion, I look at institutions like our faith-based organizations as really interesting land developers. You all have a unique opportunity, even within these different campuses, to really think about how you are stewarding the natural assets and increasing canopy. Right here, just on this block alone, the canopy that sits on this campus doesn't just benefit everyone here that's coming to visit the campus, it's also benefiting everyone within a block radius. So thinking about what are the really unique ways that this can be a natural hub of both green space and thriving trees and other flora and fauna that contribute to the ecosystem.
I love that. And I also wonder if we at Trinity, we've been having conversations around what are the particular environmental justice issues that we face in Cleveland, in the region, but especially right here in this generalized area of Cleveland. And not only is there the question of what those issues are, but again, it's the time horizon, which is we have been here for a long time, and we hope that we will be here for a long time. And to be able to identify and follow through on those things and continue to keep it as a part of our conversation, can we then become advocates in a wider conversation and use our campus as both our showpiece, but also just a good place to be. I mean, I've been reminded that we are one of 2 places with any green space in the campus district.
Yeah.
So that's an important thing that we want to preserve as well. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop interrupting.
No, you're fine.
No, I won't, but keep going.
So this is just talking a little bit about the canopy goal here in the city of Cleveland. So when the Cleveland Tree Coalition was first created, it released a document called the Cleveland Tree Plan. And the Cleveland Tree Plan really operates as our North Star action plan map on how we're going to increase canopy. But first and foremost, it looked at a serious set of data and identified what we needed to do in order to actually increase that canopy. So as it stands right now, just from a planting perspective, because I always talk about this from planting and then establishment and maintenance, because they have to be hand in hand in order for us to realistically reach our goal. But here in the city of Cleveland, in order for us to reach a 30% tree canopy by 2040, we need to be planting 28,000 trees per year, which really lets you know the scale, the magnitude of how much we need to plant. But it doesn't stop there. Planting is obviously something that we need to be doing and that we need to be facilitating. And the coalition is right now facilitating at a scale of about 5,000 trees annually. So we're growing slowly but surely, but also the investment in maintenance. In order for us to realistically hit our goal, there needs to be a significant investment in establishing trees. So whenever I talk about tree planting, it's not just planting a tree. Trees are just like babies. They have to go through young tree training, which is the first 3 years of its life. They have to go through a regular cycle of weekly watering, taking about 15 gallons of water on a weekly cycle during the first 3 years. And then once it gets past that establishment period, then it has to go through regular maintenance and pruning so that it can thrive and doesn't end up becoming some type of liability, right? Like thinking about how the liability of a tree that is not maintained and well cared for. We've seen them. We see trees that are, fall down or that, become a failure, or trees that are not pruned properly in the right of way, so they become a hazard to people who are walking around. So thinking about it through the lens of both planting as well as maintaining our canopy. And honestly, from a management standpoint, we want to make sure that we have a diverse age canopy. So I think that when we think about trees, we think about them monolithically, but trees are of various size, species, and age distribution. In order for us to have a healthy, thriving urban canopy, we want to make sure that they have a wide variety of age distribution, because as we think about it, even through like the lens of humans, right? You have our elders and you have our babies. And as our elders transition on, you want a canopy to grow up along so that it can also become an elder tree as well and continue to provide max canopy benefits to a particular area. And so one of the things that I like to highlight, again, as I said, I've talked a little bit about how we got here, but again, highlighting that losing canopy does not happen in a vacuum and it does not happen overnight. And some of the reasons why we've lost canopy are behind reasons that you may not initially think when you think about trees. Of course, you have losing canopy to things like pests and invasive species, and environmental degradation. But I also like to talk about the economic destabilization of cities, especially as somebody who is an urban planner. I think about how once upon a time the city of Cleveland used to be home to 1 million residents, and we can still see the skeletal infrastructure of that. But with 1 million residents came 1 million residents worth of tax base. Now we're operating about a quarter of that population density. We have about 300,000 residents here in the city of Cleveland proper, which has significantly declined our tax base to pull from to be able to care for things like trees and parks and green space, which is why we've seen such a significant decline in those things over time, because when a municipal government is looking at its budget, is looking at its priority, what's the first thing that's going to hit the chopping block? Things that are not perceived as an immediate need. As well as I've talked, as lack of protective legislation. I'll talk a little bit more about the Urban Forestry Commission that we've recently reenacted here in the city of Cleveland. But it's extremely important for us to have a codified ordinance and legislation around the protection and provisions for our trees. If you look at any place that has a successful urban canopy, they also have very successful and implemented policy and legislation to protect their trees. So we work very closely with our local lawmakers and our local politicians to really make sure that we have the proper ordinance and legislation to also care for.
How would you rate us?
Right now, we're pretty low in rating in terms of enforcement.
Okay.
So we have codified ordinance on the book for protection. We have a tree preservation ordinance in the city of Cleveland, but the only issue is with ordinances, they're only as good as their enforcement. So if they're not being enforced, then they essentially are sitting on a shelf. So what Urban Forestry Commission is tasked with, and now us being reenacted as a body, is to figure out how we're going to begin to realistically enforce this ordinance that's been on the books since 2018. And so I talked a little bit about the Cleveland Tree Plan and what that operates as. And the goal of the Cleveland Tree Plan, number one, is to shift the public thinking about trees. Goal 2, reversing tree trends of canopy loss. And then goal 3, assuming the full stewardship of tree infrastructure. And we're getting ready to get a little bit into actual implementation. So the strategic pillars of the coalition itself, our strategic plan took the Cleveland Tree Plan and figured out how we were going to actually adopt it as an organization and then distill that into implementation. So we have 4 buckets of activity, which is engaged and informed community. So really acting as that baseline of education and outreach around the values of trees, and really engaging a wide variety of stakeholders in that process. Looking at community capacity, policy alignment, equitable neighborhood investment, which I've reinforced earlier, that it's not just about growing our canopy across the board, but really having a focus on equity. And then of course, our organizational health as a driver of all of these activities. Ooh, sorry, went too far. So one of the things that we were really happy to be able to do very early on with the organization was begin to facilitate these workshops with community development partners. So many of our CDCs in the city of Cleveland, because the city itself has not necessarily had the capacity to take care of trees and plant trees and manage all of the publicly owned trees, a lot of these CDCs have stepped up to the plate and have been doing this work. And so we developed a workshop, a framework, if you will, for them to be be able to develop their own neighborhood tree initiatives, because as I mentioned, each neighborhood has its own unique experience with tree canopy, its own unique assets and its own unique challenges. And so we really worked as kind of like that launch pad to walk them step by step through how they're developing their own urban forestry efforts and going after grant funding to facilitate things like large scale plantings in the neighborhood.
And that looks a little bit different for every CDC. And we are a part of the campus district CDC, and I'm on that board. We are also adjacent to Central Neighborhood is not a CDC, but it's Burton Bell Carr that is responsible for that. And I'll be meeting with them in the coming weeks, and for a number of reasons. And one of it, which is to also ask what is your tree plan? And are there ways that churches and individuals can offer assistance in those various neighborhood plans?
Absolutely, there is a significant role that churches and individual entities can serve in those plans. Actually, one of our largest opportunities for canopy growth is on private property in the city of Cleveland. When we went back and did another assessment of our tree canopy across public and privately owned land, we realized that our largest opportunity was on private property, which is why one of the kind of next steps of the organization is to look at large landowners, which with churches and faith-based organizations like yourself being technically large land developers, being very critical partners in these types of assessments and implementation plans. And so absolutely, I commend you for kind of driving the charge of reaching out to these partners and saying, hey, what are you all doing and how can we help provide capacity to that? Because it's going to take an all hands on deck kind of approach to get us realistically to that goal.
And one thing that I wanted to bring into the conversation is, as Episcopalians, we are part of the global Anglican Church. And there is this thing called the Anglican Forest Initiative that essentially recognizes that we're talking about Cleveland here that's gone from a 95% tree canopy to an 18% tree canopy, but this is an issue all around the world. And that for churches, wherever they are, in whatever country, city, rural, urban setting they are, to become involved in creating and maintaining a more comprehensive tree cover. So I would think there's a wonderful opportunity for us as people of faith, for us as Episcopalians, and just people who live in and love Cleveland, to connect to something that is both a racial justice issue, an environmental justice issue, and because we're Episcopalians, an aesthetic issue, because we do like our beautiful things, right? Everybody does, but that's our own sort of self-awareness or lack thereof. Anyway, so thank you for bringing that in as well.
Yeah,
Thanks.
absolutely. So one of the things that we were also, aside from having that workshop series where we were helping these neighborhoods develop what their process or what their launch pad was going to be, develop their own neighborhood tree initiatives, we were also very fortunate enough to be able to provide direct grant resources to those partners. So the Cleveland Tree Coalition, as well as Cuyahoga County, both kind of have the two grant programs in the region where most partners are applying to for tree planting dollars. So over the last 2 years, we've been able to award out about almost $1 million in grant funding to those partners to help support their tree planting efforts. And those projects look anything like planting 5 to 10 trees to planting 175 trees, or hiring residents from the community to help care for those trees. We try to be very nimble and flexible in the type of resources that we provide because each neighborhood has its own unique need. And so that program that I feel when I reflect upon my tenureship at the coalition, this is one of those things that I'm very proud of, is that we were able to not only help provide a framework, but help provide direct resources to these communities and their needs to increase tree canopy, which is something, you know, we hope to continue to keep doing. At least we have the resources to continue to keep doing over the next 2 years. And I know we're running up against time, but I wanted to touch upon a few more things. So this is our tree planting and distribution kind of fact sheet. And so since 2015, the coalition has been planting and distributing trees. And again, when I say the coalition, that's all 50 plus of its member organizations facilitating various planting and distribution projects. So as I mentioned before, right now we're planting anywhere between 3,000 to 5,000 trees annually as a collective, but there's still a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of scale to scale up to in order for us to reach that very robust goal of planting 28,000 trees per year.
How do we have 7,000 one year?
7,000 one year was probably an influx in funding during that time.
Okay.
So,
but even that is less than a third of what we want to be at.
Yep. And one of the things that's really important to mention about this particular time that we're in right now is that there is a significant investment from the government in nature-based solutions, because we are sitting in the eye and the reality of climate change and climate hazard. And so when we think about the work that we're doing for reforestation, it's not just environmental work in which we're just increasing canopy and the benefits that it provides, but it's also climate resiliency work. Yes. And when I talk about climate resiliency, I think that sometimes we talk about climate change, it can feel very pie in the sky of like, oh, what is climate change and how am I gonna be impacted by it? But the reality of it is that communities of color and low-income communities are on the front line of climate hazards. They're going to be the ones when we are experiencing the really exacerbated effects of climate change are going to be impacted the most. Climate change looks like high heat. Here in the city of Cleveland, it could be anywhere in the summertime, anywhere between 8 to 15 degrees hotter in the city proper than it is in Shaker Heights or Cleveland Heights. And what does high heat do?
That's amazing.
It exacerbates people's health conditions. Well, here in the city of Cleveland, we have a record percentage of people having poor cardiovascular health and poor respiratory health. So then there is a direct correlation between high heat occurrences and not having trees and how that has an impact on people's health. And so when we're thinking about climate, I try to make those types of connections on a human scale, real life experience, because it's very easy to think about these large themes and it kind of being lost in jargon. Yes. But there are real life implications and real life impact. And so lastly, but certainly not least, as I mentioned before, we have the Urban Forestry Commission. So the city of Cleveland used to once upon a time have an Urban Forestry Commission, probably about 16 years ago, but it went defunct underneath the Jackson administration. And so one of the things that Mayor Bibb immediately wanted to focus on as being a mayor who ran on an environmental platform was reenacting the commission. So in 2021, I had the opportunity to work alongside a group of other really wonderful folks to bring forth the legislation for the ordinance to pass for us to have a new tree commission. And in 2022, the tree commission kicked off, and I'm fortunate enough to serve as their elected chairperson. And so we serve in an advisory capacity to the Bibb administration, both his actual administration and city council, on various recommendations around policy, budget, legislation, you name it. So we are a small but mighty commission, about 11 members, full of very, very passionate subject matter experts who really want to see the city of Cleveland, especially from the public position of city-owned trees, be increased in supporting our urban forester in those efforts.
And can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with the Center for Regenerative Solutions?
Yes.
Now that you moved on, this is all what you were doing.
Yes.
Now, so I guess you're always doing this.
Yes, so I'm always doing trees. So now with my new role, the Center for Regenerative Solutions, I'm the director of urban forestry initiatives. We work in a few buckets around natural environmental assets. But right now, we were fortunate enough to receive this really huge grant from the federal government. So a few years ago, through the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a $1.5 billion allocation to community and urban forestry, because even the White House saw that there was going to be a significant need to invest in natural infrastructure to help combat combat climate change. And so we received a $30 million grant that we have the great fortune and honor to be able to support 25 cities across the entire country in their urban forestry efforts. So I manage that portfolio of cities. I also am in the process of, we're piloting this nationwide summer youth employment program for youth. So one of the things that we also realized was an immediate need is when we talk about equity, right, in forestry, I think a lot of times it's just talked about from where we're planting trees. So planting trees in low canopy areas, but it's also looking at how green infrastructure in this new Green Deal through this significant investment in the federal government is going to have economic implications on community. There's a real need and a real opportunity for all folks, but really specifically our program is focusing on youth to find their way in these environmental jobs. There are so many different positions and career paths that are being created because of this investment in green infrastructure and climate resiliency and environmental justice. And so figuring out unique ways to both bridge and create opportunities for youth to be exposed to that, and also bridge some of the challenges of maintenance. So what the students will be working on over the summer in 5 cities across the country is maintenance. They are going to be doing maintenance programs. So they're going to get trained on how to care for trees, how to water trees, and then be deployed in their neighborhoods to do that on a weekly basis over the course of 6 weeks.
That is remarkable. That's
very
really
exciting.
Wonderful.
We're having the opportunity to bridge it and make it a real life experience, not just from them being armed and aware of the importance and benefit that nature provides, but also seeing the impacts of, honestly, child poverty. Like childhood poverty here in Cuyahoga County is astronomical, and Cleveland is one of the cities that we're partnering with for this program. We're piloting in partnership with the City of Cleveland and the Student Conservation Association. But being able to provide viable, livable wage paying jobs to youth who really need it. Yeah. As a kid myself, I grew up participating in the Wild Youth program every single year. I benefited from a lot of these programs that provided both youth professional development as well as youth exposure. So we're really excited to be able to really kind of cultivate a new generation of tree stewards.
That's wonderful. And one thing that I remember from the City Club Forum was the statement, and you have made, it may have been you making it or one of the other wonderful panelists, that all the things that we want to see happen in terms of outcomes, health outcomes, prosperity outcomes, correlate directly with if there is a healthy tree canopy. Yeah, like everything you want that's good in a city is going to happen in neighborhoods where there are better tree presence.
Yep, when you look at the aggregation of wealth and you also look at canopy coverage, your most wealthy affluent communities also have the highest percentage of canopy. They also have the highest percentage of parks and green space, both passive and recreational. And so when we begin to think about marrying all of these layers of workforce development and environmental planning and protection and provisions, then you begin to see that it's not just this sole tree that we're talking about, but this ecosystem of direct and co-benefits that it can provide to a community's wellness.
Right. It's from an integrative perspective, it's just amazing how much it all connects to one another.
Yep.
Well, Samira, thank you so much, and helping us to envision and seeing clearly where we are. This is what an 18% tree canopy looks like. Can we imagine what in 50 or 100 years a 50, a 60, an 80, or let's just go all the way. Let's go up to back to 95% tree canopy. Just what a difference in terms of human dignity and human flourishing we could be talking about. Well, we have just a couple of minutes. Do we have any questions for Samira? And please introduce yourself.
Give the option of planting a tree instead of, sending flowers. But I have no idea where those trees are being planted.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you could make a comment, but it was great because you could do it very inexpensively and very easily. And
Yeah.
come
Yeah. I've heard about that being offered in some of these like end of life services, but I have not yet seen a quantified amount of how many of those trees are being planted and where. But that's also something that I would like to poke into and figure out, because I think programs like that are great. It's just thinking about also how those trees are being maintained and established for the long haul, because we want to see them established far past 3 years. We want to see them grow and live to their full maturity, because that's where they begin to present full canopy benefit. But that's a great question. I would actually love to poke around and see where some of those trees are.
Thank you. Tony. For the podcast, Tony asked if Samira could speak a little bit to automobiles and public transportation as how that impacts moving forward.
Yeah, so when we're thinking about especially transportation and transportation emissions in the public right-of-way, it has an immense impact on our tree canopy, which is where we get into the conversation of like species selection and prioritization. So, of course, as you know, there are really harsh emissions that transportation, pushes out into the environment, and sometimes it has a constant impact on our natural assets. So one of the things that you'll see a lot of times in cities like the city of Cleveland, in the right-of-way, plantings are typically a mixture of like native, but a lot of times non-native trees, because they're a lot more hardy and a lot more resistant to some of those harsh environmental conditions that transportation plays. But I don't think, one of the things that I say that I want us to find a natural balance in striking is figuring out the balance of having the built environment, which involves built structure as well as our vehicles and infrastructure for that, and the natural environment. And I don't think that those two necessarily have to exist within conflict with one another, but there has to be concessions made to make sure, there has to be concessions made to make sure that the two can exist within the same environment with one another. And one of the things that is also really interesting about cars and car infrastructure is I think that right now where we're seeing infrastructure projects happening all over the country, but even here in the city of Cleveland, there are a lot of roadway construction projects that are being slighted. And so thinking about what are the unique ways that we can incorporate infrastructure within those roadway projects to increase canopy presence. Right now, unfortunately, when you drive around the city of Cleveland and you look at the tree beds for tree canopy, they're either this big or none at all. And that's because there's been an over prioritization for vehicles in the public right-of-way. But they're striking that balance of making sure that there's also the proper infrastructure for things like trees as well as flowers and other flora and fauna in the right-of-way. But I think that we kind of live in a society right now that really prioritizes vehicles, but there are practitioners like myself as well as other urban planners and landscape architects that are thinking about those types of things, of how we're creating more infrastructure in the right-of-way to accommodate both vehicles and natural assets. I hope I answered your question. Yes. Thank you.
And I think we'll conclude. One more question, Karen. Oh, I think we're at I'm afraid we have to conclude.
I was going to say you can't take one.
We got to go to church.
Okay.
Thank you all for being here. Stay tuned for an important housekeeping announcement, but we want to thank you all for being here. We thank Samira Malone of the Center for Regenerative Solutions and for your work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Please come back to Trinity anytime.
Absolutely.
And can we show you our trees?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.